Next, we're going to be looking at the CSS3 box shadow property. The box shadow property will allow you to implement multiple drop shadows, both outer and inner, on any HTML element. You can specify values for color, size, blur, and offset. Let's look at how we can get this to work. The page that I'm going to be working on is very similar to the page we were working on in the last exercise, with the exception that I added several new divs that are going to serve as example divs where we can apply some different box styling rules. The first thing that we're going to do in the CSS is we're going to style the article tag. The article tag is the tag that contains all of the content on the page, and we're going to make this article tag look as though it's being carried by two birds. In order to do that, we're going to make a rule on the container. In the HTML, there's a div with an ID of container that wraps around everything on the page. So we're going to go ahead and target that. I'll set up a CS rule to hook the container. I'm going to set an overall width of 900 pixels, and I'll set margin of 0 and auto. This will ensure that the container is centered in the middle of the page. I'm going to add some padding, and the padding is going to serve to push the container away from the top of the page. So I'm going to push it down by 150 pixels, and I'm going to leave the other three properties at 0. And then I'm going to set the background, and we'll just have an image appear here. And I'm going to tell the image to be horizontally centered and appear 85 pixels from the top of the page, and I'm going to tell it not to repeat. If we save the page and look at it in the browser, you're now going to see that this image with the two birds is going to appear on my page. In addition to that, the content has now been pushed over. Now we're going to hook the article tag, and we're going to make the article appear as though it's inside of a rounded rectangle. So I'll make another rule in my CSS for article, and I'm going to set the margin to 72 pixels for the top and 0 for the rest of the edges of my box. I'm going to set the background color to a transparent white. And I'm going to specify a border radius so that the edge of the box will be rounded. We'll use 1em for that. And finally, I'm just going to add some padding to push the content away from the edge of the box. If I save my page and we look in the browser, it now looks like this. In addition to that, I think I'll put a border around the edge of the article as well. Okay, great. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some rules for these three divs. In order to target the divs, I'm going to use the selector of hash container, and then I'm going to use div nth of type. I can't use nth child here. I'm going to need to use nth of type since this div is actually a child of a parent div. So I've already set up the skeleton structure for us to use there. Let's make a global selector here just so we can target all of these at the same time. Let's set some width and height parameters on these. I'll set a border and a background color. If we save now, we can see that the boxes are structured like this. I also want these to appear side by side, so I'm also going to apply a float and some margin on the right. Now, because I'm not clearing my float, the article tag is collapsing underneath the boxes. We're going to go ahead and add the CSS so that we can dynamically create an item that we can clear, and we did that in one of the previous exercises, so I'll just place that on the page now. And using the pseudo class of after and passing on these properties is going to allow a clear to be generated so that the boxes now float side by side, but the parent element is going to still wrap around them. So now that I have these set up, I'm ready to start applying my box shadow properties. Let's add a little bit of padding to these as well. This will just push the content from the edge of the box in a little bit. We'll begin by creating a simple box shadow on the first box. I'm going to use the CSS selector of box shadow. Box shadow can contain a number of values. We'll start simple and build up from there. The box shadow property can accept properties that will affect color, size, blur, and offset. We're going to start fairly simple by just passing on the offset properties. I'm going to simply use 10 pixels and 10 pixels. If I save the page and we look in the browser, we're going to end up with a hard edge shadow that appears to the right and the bottom of my box. It's 10 pixels from the right edge and 10 pixels from the bottom. You can also use negative numbers here, which will pull the shadow up and to the left. So if I change these values to negative numbers and we refresh in the browser, you're going to see that now the shadow appears on the upper and left part of the box. I'm going to copy this property and we'll paste it into the second box that we're using. Let's have this shadow be in the lower right, and then in addition to the horizontal and vertical offset, I'm going to set a blur amount. I'll set the blur amount to be 5 pixels. If we save now and look in the browser, you're going to see that this second shadow has more of a soft edge. It kind of becomes more diffused along the edge. Obviously, if you increase this amount, the shadow is going to become more blurry on the edge. If I change that from 5 pixels to 20, you can see that the edge of my shadow becomes much more blurred and softer. In addition to this setting, you can also set the spread, which is going to control the distance of the shadow. Let's change the blur down to 0, and then let me put a spread of 10 pixels on my box. You can see that this shadow is much thicker than the shadow on box 1, even though they're both set to 10 pixels. The spread is pushing the shadow away from the parent element. If we add a blur to this as well, we'll change the blur back to 20 and save, you're going to see that the area before the diffusion occurs is much thicker. That's being controlled by the spread. Another parameter that you can pass on to the box shadow is the color of the shadow. So if I plug in a value for color, you'll see that when I refresh in the browser, the shadow is now blue instead of black. Black is the default color, but you can control the color by specifying any color value that you want. Another option that you can include on your box shadow is to include an inner shadow. You do that by specifying inset. Then you need to pass on the horizontal and vertical offsets. You can pass on a blur amount and a spread if you desire. You can see that now the shadow on box 3 appears on the inside of the box as opposed to the outside of the box. It is worth noting that when you do an inset shadow, positive numbers create the shadow on the upper left-hand side as opposed to the outer shadows, which positive numbers will create the shadow on the right and bottom edge of the box. So if we wanted the inset shadow to be on the right and bottom edge, we would use negative numbers there instead of positive numbers. I'm just going to put some comments on these rules so that we can remember what they are, and I'm going to comment these out so that we can use these same boxes to apply some different settings. I'll change the first settings box here to use a box shadow of 0 for the horizontal offset, 0 for the vertical offset, but then I'm going to set the blur amount and the spread amount, and I'll pass on a mid-tone gray for the color. If I save and we go look at this in the browser, the first box is now going to have a shadow that appears all the way around the box. What this is doing is it's almost creating more of like an outer glow. If we used a more vibrant color like this hex value, the glow is now going to appear to be limey green. You can do all kinds of cool things by setting the horizontal and vertical offset to 0 and then using the spread to increase the distance of the shadow. And you may or may not want to use a blur amount in conjunction with that. In addition to these types of settings, you can also create multiple shadows. Multiple shadows works in a similar way to incorporating multiple background images. You simply separate the box shadows by commas. Let's do that on the second box. I'm going to reduce the size of the shadow on the outside a bit, and then I'm going to get rid of the semicolon and create a comma, and then we'll pass on some additional values for more shadows. For the second shadow, I'm going to use a larger horizontal offset, but we'll pull it in the negative direction. I'll also pull a shadow in the vertical direction using negative numbers, which will pull it below the box. I'm going to set the blur amount. We'll use 10 pixels here. Increasing the blur amount is going to make the shadow extend farther out from the edge of the box. So when you set a shadow with, for instance, a 10 pixel horizontal offset that has a blur amount of 10 pixels, the blur radius will be 20 pixels of the total shadow. The spread is an optional amount, and positive values are going to increase the size of the shadow, negative values are going to decrease the size of the shadow. The default is 0 if you don't specify anything. We're not going to specify anything here. Then we'll pass on an RGBA value. And as this is the last shadow that I'll want to place on my box right now, I'll terminate with a semicolon. If we save and we look in the browser, the second box now has two shadows, the blue shadow in the lower right and the yellow shadow in the upper left-hand corner. Let's add some additional shadows to this box as well. I'm going to change the semicolon to a comma, and then I'll pass on some additional values. This time I'm going to use my inset value. I'm going to set the size of the shadow to 8 pixels for the horizontal and 16 pixels for the vertical. We're going to set the blur amount to 4 pixels, a spread amount to 6 pixels, and let's set the color to orange. If we save and we refresh in the browser, you can now see that there's a more hard edge shadow in the upper and left corners of the box. You can see that the shadow on the top is thicker than the shadow on the left because I used a higher numeric value there. I'm going to set one more shadow, and I'm going to copy this last line right here. I'll change the semicolon to a comma, and we're going to set the offset to be negative numbers. I'm going to keep the same values, but I'm going to set the color to be a darker shade of orange, and I'll use a hex value to do that. If I save and we refresh in the browser, you can now see that our box has different shadows on the right and lower corners as opposed to the upper and left-hand corners. You can add as many shadows as you want to a box, and you can come up with all sorts of creative solutions. The shadows also work in conjunction with rounded corners. If I simply set the border radius, and we'll just do this on the last box and save, you can see that the shadow will now show up on rounded corners. Let's add one more shadow to that last box. I'll save my page and we'll refresh in the browser, and now you can see that this last box has an outer and inner shadow applied to it. Obviously, there's all sorts of ways that you can incorporate shadows into your project. You can get very creative utilizing this. What we are going to do is we're going to add some box shadow settings to the article tag just to make this stand off the page a little bit more. I'm going to go into the rule that I already have for article, and I will add some additional declarations. I'm going to simply use box shadow, and we'll set the first box shadow to 0 and 0 for horizontal and vertical offsets. We're going to set 0 for the blur and 2 pixels for the spread, and then I'm going to set the color to be a yellow color. Then I'll use a comma, and I'm going to add some additional properties here. I'm going to add a inner shadow. We'll make this be 5 pixels by 5 pixels for vertical and horizontal offset. I'm going to set 10 pixels for the blur. The spread will leave at 0, and for the RGBA values I'll pass on the colors that I need to define the blue that I want to use. I'm going to set this to be 80% opacity, and I'm also going to pass on the inset. This will be a shadow on the inside of the box. Inset can be used at the beginning or at the end of the declaration. The values that you pass on don't have to go in any specific order. Then I'm going to make a shadow that is going to be dark green that's going to appear in the lower right hand corner. I'll set the blur amount to 20 pixels, spread to 0, and I'll pass on the RGBA values. And then the last shadow that I'm going to pass on is going to be a outer blue thick shadow. This is something that I want to appear all the way around the box, so I'm going to use 0 for the horizontal and vertical offsets as well as the blur. I'm going to set 8 pixels for the spread, and then I'm going to specify the color as being 069. I'll terminate with a semicolon. Let's save, and if we look at this in the browser, you can now see that I have an inner shadow, I have a dark green outer shadow, and then I actually have two shadows which look more like strokes on the edge of the box. I have the yellow and I have the blue. In addition to that, I already have the black, which is a result of the border that I had added originally to my article tag. So box shadows can be used to create drop shadows, inset shadows, or even multiple borders. You can do all sorts of creative things by using the CSS3 box shadow property.